The most important educational reform in European history wasn't launched by a professor, a philosopher, or a priest. It was launched by a warlord who could barely write his own name. According to his biographer Einhard, Charlemagne kept wax tablets under his pillow, practicing letters late at night. Yet this man launched the most ambitious intellectual revival Europe had seen in centuries. Why would a conqueror care this much about books? The answer reshapes how we think about power and knowledge. To understand why Charlemagne did this, we need to understand the three pillars his entire rule rested on. First, traditional Frankish war leadership inherited from the Merovingian dynasty before him. Second, a deep alliance with the church that went far beyond anything previous Frankish kings had attempted. Third, the revival of the Roman imperial idea. The Merovingians had the first two in rudimentary form. Charlemagne transformed them and added the third. Of these three pillars, one was uniquely powerful and uniquely personal: sacred monarchy. Charlemagne didn't see himself as merely a political ruler. He saw himself as a minister accountable to God for the salvation of his people. Sacred monarchy means the king's role is spiritual stewardship, not just military command or tax collection. The king stands between God and his subjects, responsible for their souls. Here's the causal chain that drove everything. God holds the king accountable. The king is responsible for his subjects' spiritual welfare. Therefore, the king must provide education and correct religious practice. If God will judge you for your subjects' ignorance and sin, then education becomes a matter of eternal consequence, not a luxury, not a hobby, a sacred obligation. This theological conviction, not mere cultural appreciation, powered the Carolingian Renaissance. A capitulary, by the way, is a royal directive issued by Carolingian rulers, organized into chapters, but spiritual accountability alone doesn't explain the shape the program took. For that, we need to look at who Charlemagne was actually ruling. His empire was a patchwork: Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, Aquitanians, Bretons, peoples with different languages, customs, and levels of Christianization. The Roman Imperial revival wasn't nostalgia. It was a governance model for holding this diversity together. Latin and classical learning could serve as a shared cultural operating system. So all three pillars converge. As a war leader, Charlemagne needed loyalty across diverse peoples. As a sacred monarch, he needed his subjects educated in the faith. As a revived Roman emperor, he needed a shared intellectual framework. The revival of learning wasn't any one of these impulses. It was the point where all three met. Education became simultaneously a military strategy, a spiritual duty, and an imperial project. So we know why he did it. But what did it look like in practice? Here are Charlemagne's own words from one of his capitularies. We are concerned to restore with diligent zeal the workshops of knowledge which, through the negligence of our ancestors, have been well nigh deserted. We invite others by our own example, as much as lies within our power, to learn to practice the liberal arts. Every phrase matters. Restore, not invent. He's recovering what was lost. Workshops of knowledge, learning as infrastructure, like a forge or a mill. Negligence of our ancestors, an open acknowledgement of civilizational decline. Our own example, the emperor leads by personal participation. Liberal arts, the classical curriculum, now state policy. Notice, this is a government directive, not a diary entry, not a patron expressing personal taste. It's a royal order commanding the restoration of education across an empire. This distinction matters because it separates the Carolingian Renaissance from what most people think of when they hear the word Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance, 6 centuries later, worked in a fundamentally different way. Here's the key analytical comparison. The Carolingian Renaissance was a top-down imperial directive. The Italian Renaissance emerged bottom-up and spontaneously. The Carolingian agents were the imperial court, monasteries, and cathedral schools. The Italian agents were city-based humanists, wealthy patrons, and universities. The Carolingian purpose was governance and the salvation of souls. The Italian purpose was intellectual exploration and aesthetic achievement. The Carolingian scope was empire-wide. The Italian was decentralized across competing city-states. The Carolingian relationship to antiquity was recovery and preservation, saving texts from oblivion. The Italian was reinterpretation and innovation, building something new from the classical inheritance. Calling both Renaissances can mislead. They share the impulse to recover the classical past, but differ in almost every structural way. One more detail worth noting. Scholars like Alcuin of York weren't decorative court poets, they were policy architects. The liberal arts program, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, had real political and spiritual consequences. This was a rare moment when intellectuals directed the governance, not merely adorned it. Did it work? At least partially, and the legacy is enormous. Carolingian scriptoria preserved classical texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. The minuscule script they developed became the basis for modern lowercase letters, the ones you're reading right now. The educational infrastructure they built, cathedral schools, standardized curricula, laid the groundwork that eventually produced the medieval university. We tend to think of Renaissances as organic cultural flowerings. Charlemagne's example shows that sometimes the revival of knowledge is a deliberate act of statecraft, driven not by curiosity alone, but by a ruler's conviction that ignorance is a sin he will personally answer for before God.